Good morning. It's great to be back in Oslo and to be able to chair a meeting of the NATO Foreign Ministers here at the Oslo City Hall. We have a quite extensive agenda where we'll address several issues as we prepare for the upcoming Vilnius Summit in July in Vilnius. And not least, we will discuss how to step up and sustain our support for Ukraine. Over the last months, NATO allies and partners have provided unprecedented level of support to Ukraine, helping them to retake and liberate Ukrainian territory. We will also discuss Ukraine's membership aspirations, and all allies agree that the NATO's door is open for new members. All allies also agree that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. And all allies agree that it is for the NATO allies and Ukraine to decide when Ukraine becomes a member. It's not for Moscow to have a veto against NATO enlargement. But most importantly, all allies agree that the most urgent and important task now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation. President Putin, Russia must not win this war. We need to ensure that Ukraine prevails after this war. And when the war ends, we need to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself, that this pattern of Russian aggression against Ukraine really stops. And therefore we need to have in place frameworks to provide guarantees for Ukrainian security after the end of the war, so history doesn't repeat itself. We will also discuss other issues, including deterrence and defense, where we will make new important decisions at the Vilnius Summit. And of course this builds on the big adaptation that has taken place in NATO since 2014, where we implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in a generation. And part of that will also be to address the need for increased defense spending. Meaning that I expect that when the leaders meet, and also one of the issues that will be discussed here today, we will make sure that 2% of GDP for defense is not a ceiling, something we strive towards, but it will be a floor, a minimum for what is needed to meet obligations as a NATO ally. We'll also address how to further strengthen our partnership with the Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea. And then also expect many allies or allies to express strong support for Sweden becoming a full member of the alliance as soon as possible. I spoke with President Erdogan earlier this week, and again I always highlight the importance of making progress on the accession of Sweden, and I will also travel to Ankara in the near future to continue to address how we can ensure the fastest possible accession of Sweden. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
VG Norway, how will you convince Erdogan and Turkey to accept Sweden, and when will you travel to Ankara?
So first of all, we have to remember that all allies, also Turkey, invited Sweden to become a full member. That happened at the NATO summit last year in Madrid. And so far this has been a very quick accession process, because Finland and Sweden applied in May. Already in June, both Finland and Sweden were invited. Finland is already a full-fledged member, and I'm confident, of course, that also Sweden will be a member. And then we are working for that to happen as early as possible. My message is that Swedish membership, full-fledged membership of NATO, it's good for Sweden, it's good for the Nordic countries, for Norway, for the Baltic region, but it's also good for the whole of NATO. This will strengthen NATO, make NATO stronger, and that's of course also good for Turkey and all other allies. And again, the important decision to invite Turkey happened last year, and that has also put Sweden in a much safer and stronger place. Sweden, as an invitee to the alliance, after the decision to invite them last summer, Sweden is now integrating more and more into NATO structures, our military structures, our civilian structures, and several allies also provided bilateral security assurances for Sweden. So it's absolutely inconceivable that there will be any threat or any attack against Sweden without NATO reacting. I will travel to Ankara in the near future. Exactly when is not yet decided.
On Ukrainian membership, Mr. Stoltenberg, are you optimistic that allies will agree on a stronger language, meaning that you can give some concrete steps for Ukraine in order to achieve the membership?
So I'm confident that we will find consensus and a way forward, and we have had good informal discussions already. And we agree on some core messages. So as late as last year, all allies agreed that Ukraine will become a member of this alliance. And we are making concrete steps because Ukraine is moving towards NATO, meaning that they are coming closer and closer, meaning that they are moving from Soviet standards to NATO standards, equipment, doctrines, and we are helping them doing that as we speak. And we have done it since 2014. So Ukraine is much closer to NATO now than just a few years ago. And of course, after the full-fledged invasion last year, with a substantial military support, including training, we are helping Ukraine to move closer to NATO membership. So when allies now start to, for instance, train them to use fourth generation NATO standard aircraft, that helps them to actually be able to operate modern aircrafts, but it also helps them to come closer to NATO doctrines and interoperability. So yes, we are moving, and yes, all allies agree that Ukraine will become a member.
Mr. Stoltenberg, yesterday you drew a line from the terrorist attack in Norway in 2011 and compared it to Russia's attack on Ukraine. Is it your opinion that the missile attacks on Kiev, for instance, are acts of terror from Russia?
So deliberate attacks on civilians is a war crime. And there is a line between what we saw here in Norway on the 22nd of July 2011 and a war aggression against a sovereign independent nation, Ukraine. Because the intention is the same, and that is to use force, illegal force, to obtain political goals. And therefore, I think it's also extremely important that those who are responsible are held accountable for war crimes, and that also the International Criminal Court has the capabilities and is able to conduct the necessary investigations to establish the fact, to collect proof, because those responsible for war crimes in Ukraine must be held accountable.
Anadolu Agency. I would like to ask about your decision regarding the sending additional troops to Kosovo as well as keeping a battalion ready. Is it means that NATO thinks that there will be no common ground reached by the sides of the conflict soon, and also NATO prepares for an evolvement of the clashes to a bigger conflict like Russia's war in Ukraine?
So what we have seen in Kosovo is increased tensions, and we have also seen the violence against NATO peacekeepers, the KFOR forces. And this is totally unacceptable, unprovoked violence against peacekeepers from NATO with a clear UN mandate. And of course, NATO will remain vigilant. We will be there to ensure a safe and secure environment and also to calm down and reduce the tensions. to ensure that we have the forces we need at any time, we have decided to deploy our operational reserve, and I thank allies for providing troops to that reserve, but also to make ready an additional reserve force so we can deploy even more. So the first deployment of extra troops will be around 700, and they are on their way. But of course, this does not mean that we are giving up on a political solution. Our message both to Belgrade and to Pristina is that they have to engage in good faith in the EU-facilitated dialogue. That's the only path to peace. But at the same time, NATO has the responsibility to ensure stability in Kosovo, and that's the reason why we have been there for many years and why we now are increasing our presence in the region.
Yes, the other day you said that Ukraine has the right to defend itself. On the question of how you react to possible Ukraine attacks on Russian soil. Based on that statement and also signals from other NATO countries concerning attacks on Russian soil, is there a shift in NATO now on how you regard possible Ukraine or Ukraine-affiliated attacks on Moscow, for instance, within NATO?
We have exactly the same position now as we had at the beginning of the war, and that is that Ukraine has the right to defend itself. Russia's war aggression against Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law. The right of self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter, and there is no doubt what this is. This is a war aggression by President Putin and Moscow against Ukraine, and Ukraine has the right to defend itself. President Putin, Moscow started this war, and they can end this war. And that's the way to create peace and stability and to ensure no further escalation of the war. So we support Ukraine. We will continue to support Ukraine. We'll stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that does not make NATO and NATO allies party to the conflict. We have the right to support Ukraine without becoming a party to the conflict. And of course, fundamentally, NATO has two tasks in this conflict. One is to provide support to Ukraine, as we do. The other is to prevent this conflict in Ukraine, the Russian war aggression against Ukraine, to escalate beyond Ukraine. And that's the reason why we have increased our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance on NATO territory, with land forces, air forces, naval forces, to remove any room for misunderstanding, miscalculation in Moscow about NATO's readiness to protect every inch of NATO territory. The reason why we do that is, of course, to prevent escalation beyond Ukraine.
My question is, in particular, when it comes to support for Ukraine and long-term support for Ukraine, what kind of specific long-term commitments are you looking for from the member states?
Well, I expect that at the meeting today we will discuss long-term support for Ukraine, and then I expect that when we meet in Vilnius, where we are going to make the decisions in July, I expect that allies will agree a long-term plan, a multi-year commitment to support Ukraine. Because what we need is to ensure that when the war ends, that Ukraine has the capabilities, the strength to defend itself, and NATO allies will of course provide different types of military support, but NATO is also now looking into how we can help them to implement this important transition from old-type Soviet era doctrines, ammunition standards, equipment to modern NATO equipment and standards. This transition has started, but when you look at the battlefield in Ukraine, you see that there is still a long way to go to ensure that everything they do is totally interoperable with NATO. So to help them to to do this transition to NATO standards, to modernize the defense and security institutions. This I expect will be this multi-year commitment by NATO allies, and including a package of different types of support with more solid funding. This comes, of course, on top of the bilateral military aid that allies have committed for many years. Norway is an example of a country that has actually agreed to a 5-year program to provide both economic but also military support to Ukraine. Other allies have now followed the example of Norway and started to provide multi-year program support commitment to Ukraine.
Mr. Secretary General, what will you say this time to President Erdogan in Ankara, and will you travel to Viktor Orban as well in Hungary?
Well, my message has been since last fall, and I will reiterate that it is in the interest of the whole of NATO to have Sweden as a full member. My message is also that Sweden is already very close to NATO, and that Sweden is in a much stronger position after the decision to invite Sweden, and that was the decision also Turkey supported when we made the decision last June. I will also highlight the fact that as of today, the 1st of June, new counter-terrorism laws have come into force in Sweden. And these laws actually makes a difference. And they demonstrate that Sweden is now taking new steps to step up the fight against terrorism, including, for instance, PKK, which is a terrorist organization not only based on the assessment of Ankara and Turkey, but also by Sweden, the European Union, and many others. And therefore, I welcome both the stronger laws, which are now coming into force in Sweden on the 1st of June, but I also welcome the fact that the cooperation between Sweden and Turkey has been strengthened, and that will also be a part of my message, that actually Sweden has demonstrated that Sweden is delivering on this trilateral memorandum that was signed in Madrid, and the fact that Sweden has delivered on those commitments just highlights the importance of making sure that Sweden becomes an ally as soon as possible. Let me also add that we have to remember that Turkey has some legitimate security concerns, because no other ally has suffered more terrorist attacks than Turkey. And therefore it is important that we work together with Turkey to fight terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. And therefore I welcome what NATO allies do, but also what Sweden has done over the last months to step up the fight against terrorism and the cooperation with Turkey.
Thank you very much. Hungary.
Well, I'm confident that also Hungary will ratify the accession protocol.
Thank you very much, colleague.
Thank you.